Hello and welcome. Tonight we're going to journey through one of the most beloved stories of our time, a tale of friendship, courage, and the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. This is the complete story of Stranger Things, from its very beginning to where it stands today. You don't need to do anything but listen. Let your mind settle as we travel together through the town of Hawkins, Indiana, through the decades and through the darkness. Whether you know this story well or are discovering it for the first time, tonight we'll experience it as one continuous thread, woven with care. So find your comfortable position, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin at the very beginning. Not in 1983, when the lights first flickered, but decades earlier, when a boy named Henry Creel first opened his eyes to a world he would never quite understand. Our story truly begins in 1947, in the post-war optimism of America, when Victor and Virginia Creel welcomed their first child into the world. They named him Henry. By all accounts, he was a normal baby, crying, sleeping, growing as babies do. But as the years passed, young Henry began to notice things that others didn't. He saw spiders weaving their webs with mathematical precision. He watched rabbits in the yard, observing their nervous twitches, their instinctive fear. He noticed how people smiled even when they were unhappy, how they said things they didn't mean, how they performed elaborate dances of deception that everyone seemed to accept as normal. Henry didn't understand these games. More troubling still, he began to feel things, emotions that weren't his own, thoughts that drifted from other minds like radio signals searching for a receiver, his mother's anxiety, his father's hidden disappointments, the neighbour's carefully concealed resentments. Most children learn to navigate the social world by accepting its rules. Henry couldn't. To him, human civilization looked like an elaborate trap, a cage people had built for themselves and pretended to enjoy. He found more honesty in the predator and prey relationships of animals, clear, truthful, without pretense. As Henry grew into adolescence, something else developed alongside his philosophical disillusionment: power, real power. He discovered he could move small objects with his mind. He could make the rabbits in the yard freeze, paralyzed by fear that seemed to come from nowhere. He could make his sister Alice's toys float across her bedroom while she slept. These weren't tricks or imagination. Henry Creel had abilities that shouldn't exist, and with each passing year, they grew stronger. In March of 1959, the Creel family moved into a beautiful Victorian house at the edge of Hawkins, Indiana. Victor Creel had inherited some money and wanted a fresh start for his family. The house was perfect, spacious, elegant, with a beautiful stained glass window of a rose in the front door. But from the moment they moved in, things felt wrong. At first it was small things, lights flickering, a feeling of being watched. Virginia Creel began to seem more anxious, more withdrawn. Young Alice became jumpy, sleeping poorly. Victor tried to maintain normalcy, but even he sensed something oppressive in the air. Something that settled over the house like a heavy blanket. What the family didn't know was that the darkness in the house wasn't coming from the house at all. It was coming from Henry. Now a teenager, Henry had been exploring the full extent of his abilities. He had learned he could project his consciousness into the minds of others, experiencing their thoughts and memories as if they were his own. More than that, he could influence them, plant suggestions, manipulate emotions, create visions that seemed entirely real. Henry had been secretly tormenting his family for weeks, conducting experiments on them like a scientist studying specimens. He wanted to see how far he could push them, how much psychological pressure they could endure before breaking. On the night of March 25th, 1959, Henry decided to complete his experiment. He started with the animals. The family dog, dying slowly, painfully. Then Victor, still in bed, experiencing visions so horrific that he fled into the hallway. seeing things that couldn't possibly be real. Virginia, tormented by her worst fears made manifest. And finally, young Alice, Henry's own sister, pulled from her bed, her bones beginning to break one by one as Henry's power crushed her from within. Victor ran to get help, desperate and terrified. When he returned with neighbours, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. Virginia and Alice both dead, their bodies broken in ways that defied explanation, and Henry, alive but comatose, in what appeared to be a deep catatonic state. Victor Creel was arrested and charged with the murders. He insisted that a demon had done this, that some malevolent force had invaded their home. No one believed him. He was convicted and sent to Penhurst Asylum for the criminally insane, where he would spend the rest of his life. But Henry wasn't comatose. He was conscious, aware, experiencing his first taste of true consequence. In pushing his powers to their limit, he had damaged himself, left himself vulnerable, and that vulnerability would lead to his first real captivity. Dr. Martin Brenner heard about the Creel case with great interest. As a scientist working on government-funded research into psychic phenomena and human potential, he recognized what others had missed: the signs of genuine telekinetic and telepathic ability. He arranged for young Henry to be quietly transferred to his care at Hawkins National Laboratory, a secret facility funded by the Department of Energy but actually devoted to much more clandestine research. The Cold War was at its height, and the government wanted weapons, including weapons of the mind. Henry Creel became Subject 1. The first, Brenner studied him, tested him, tried to understand the source and limits of his extraordinary abilities. But Henry was too dangerous, too powerful, too uncontrollable. Eventually, Brenner made a difficult decision. He implanted a chip in Henry's neck, a device that would suppress his powers and keep him docile. For years, Henry remained in this diminished state, his abilities locked away, serving as an orderly in the very facility that held him prisoner. But Brenner's ambitions didn't end with Henry. Inspired by Subject 1, he launched a program to create more individuals with similar abilities. The program recruited pregnant women, exposed them to experimental drugs, tried to artificially induce psychic abilities in their children. Most failed, some succeeded in small ways. But one, a young girl who would be designated Subject 11, showed extraordinary promise. Her name was Jane Ives, though she would never know that name in childhood. Her mother, Terry Ives, had volunteered for Dr. Brenner's experiments while pregnant, not understanding what she was truly signing up for. When Jane was born showing clear signs of psychic ability, Brenner took her, telling Terry the baby had died during childbirth. Terry knew better. She searched for years, broke into the laboratory, tried to rescue her daughter. Brenner stopped her with electroshock therapy so severe that it left Terry in a permanent catatonic state, mentally repeating the same few moments over and over for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Jane, now called only 11, grew up in the laboratory. Dr. Brenner became the only parent she knew, calling himself Papa while subjecting her to endless tests and training exercises. She learned to move objects with her mind, to see distant places, to enter people's thoughts. She also learned that disobedience brought punishment, that the world outside the laboratory was dangerous, and that Papa's approval was the only warmth she would ever know. Other children lived in the laboratory too, other numbered subjects. Some showed small abilities, others served as control groups. They all lived in fear of Brenner's disapproval, desperate for any scrap of kindness from the man who claimed to care for them while treating them as experiments. Among them, working as an orderly, was Henry Creel, Subject 1, still wearing the suppressor chip that kept his vast powers in check. 11 didn't know who he really was. To her, he was just Peter, a kind orderly who seemed to understand her loneliness. By September 1979, 11 was 8 years old and the most powerful subject Brenner had ever produced. but she was also starting to question, to push back against the tests and punishments. The orderly called Peter noticed this, noticed her strength, her growing independence. One day, Peter revealed the truth to her. He wasn't just an orderly, he was Subject 1, the first like her. The chip in his neck suppressed his powers, but if she could remove it, he could be free. More than that, he could help her escape. They could both be free. 11 trusted him. Using her abilities, she removed the chip. The moment it was gone, Henry Creel's powers returned in full force, not just as they had been in 1959, but stronger, refined, matured by 2 decades of suppression. He had been planning this moment for years. What happened next would later be called the Hawkins Laboratory Massacre. Henry moved through the laboratory like a storm of vengeance. Every person who had worked there, every scientist and guard who had enabled his captivity, he killed them all. Not quickly, but slowly, breaking their bodies with his mind, lifting them into the air as their bones snapped one by one. The children were not spared. One by one, the other numbered subjects died, their small bodies no match for Henry's rage. 2, 3, 4, all the way through 10. He moved methodically, deliberately, showing them the same lack of mercy that had been shown to him. 11 hid, terrified, realizing too late what she had unleashed. When Henry finally found her, he didn't kill her immediately. Instead, he tried to recruit her. He told her they were alike, that the world outside the laboratory was a cage just like this one, that people were small and cruel and pretending otherwise. He offered her freedom, true freedom, beyond society's rules. But 11 refused, despite everything Brenner had done to her, despite the isolation and the pain. She had learned something Henry never could. That connection mattered, that people were worth saving, that kindness existed even in darkness, she fought back. The battle between them shook the laboratory. 2 immensely powerful psychics locked in combat. Windows shattered. Equipment exploded. The very walls began to crack. Henry was stronger, more experienced, but 11 fought with desperate determination. In that moment, 11 reached deeper into her power than she ever had before. She felt something beyond the physical world, a tier in reality itself, a place between places. With every ounce of strength she possessed, she pushed Henry toward it, pushed him away, pushed him out. A gateway opened, a rift in space and time. Henry Creel was pulled through it, banished to somewhere else entirely. Somewhere dark, somewhere cold, somewhere that existed alongside our world but separate from it. Like a shadow dimension, pressed against our reality. The gate closed. Henry was gone. 11 collapsed, her nose bleeding, her energy completely spent. When Dr. Brenner found her among the bodies of the other children, he didn't punish her. Instead, he held her, told her it wasn't her fault, made her believe that the monster she'd unleashed was the real villain, and that she'd saved them all. But what Brenner didn't tell her, what he couldn't know, was that in creating that rift, 11 hadn't just banished Henry. She had opened a door. She had connected our world to another dimension, one that would later be called the Upside Down. And in that dimension, Henry Creel began to change. The place where Henry landed was like nothing on Earth. It was Hawkins, but wrong, a dark mirror version where the sky was always churning, where the air was thick with floating spores, where nothing living could survive in any recognizable form. The impact of his arrival had been devastating. His body was broken, burned, barely alive. In the normal world, he would have died. But this dimension operated under different rules. Henry lay there for days, weeks perhaps. Time moved strangely in this place. His body began to heal, but not in any human way. The dimension itself seemed to seep into him, transforming him at a fundamental level. His burned skin hardened into something else. His broken bones reformed into new configurations. Vines began to grow from him, connecting him to the dimension itself. He was becoming something new, something that was no longer quite Henry Creel, no longer quite human. He was becoming the thing that would later be known as Vecna. But Henry retained his consciousness, his memories, his philosophy. If anything, his time in this dimension reinforced his beliefs. Here, without the pretense of human civilization, existence was stripped down to its raw truth. Predator and prey, strength and weakness, life consuming life. As he explored this dark version of Hawkins, Henry discovered he wasn't alone. There was something else here, something vast and ancient, something that had existed in this dimension long before he arrived. A collective consciousness of sorts, distributed across countless particles in the air, forming and reforming into different configurations. Some would later call it the Mind Flayer, after a creature from a children's game. Henry observed this entity with fascination. It was powerful, but unfocused, lacking direction or purpose. It simply existed, drifting through this dimension like a force of nature. But Henry saw potential in it. If he could connect with it, influence it, bend it to his will, he would have access to power beyond anything he'd possessed before. Over the years between 1979 and 1983, Henry Creel, now fully transformed into Vecna, learned to manipulate this dimension. He discovered he could create creatures from its substance, shape the environment, and most importantly, he could reach back through to the other side, to Hawkins, to the world that had rejected him. He began to plan, not just for revenge, though that was part of it, but for something larger, a way to tear down the barrier between dimensions entirely, to bring this truth, this raw reality, to the world that had caged him. All he needed was a way to open the gate again. And in November 1983, his opportunity would come. On the evening of November 6, 1983, 4 boys sat around a table in a basement in Hawkins, Indiana, rolling dice and arguing about the rules of Dungeons and Dragons. Mike Wheeler, Lucas Sinclair, Dustin Henderson, and Willa. Byers had been friends for years, the kind of friends who spoke in references only they understood, who defended each other against bullies, who knew each other's homes as well as their own. It was late when the game ended. Will's mother Joyce was already worried. She always worried about Will, the smallest and quietest of the group. He grabbed his bike and headed home through the dark streets of Hawkins, a small town where everyone knew everyone and nothing bad ever really happened. Except that night, something did. Will was riding through the woods on the edge of town when his bike light began to flicker. He stopped, confused. The air felt wrong somehow, charged with static electricity. And then he heard it, a sound like a growl, like something large and predatory was nearby. Will ran. He pedaled as fast as he could, but whatever was chasing him was faster. He made it to his house, crashed through the front door, reached for the phone to call for help. But the lights were flickering, and the thing, whatever it was already there. In a moment of desperate instinct, Will ran to the shed in the backyard, grabbed his father's rifle, and tried to defend himself. But when he turned around, what he saw froze him with primal terror. It wasn't a bear, or a wolf, or anything he could name. It was something else entirely. Tall, humanoid but wrong, with no face except a mouth that opened like a terrible flower of teeth. Later, the boys would call it the Demogorgon, named after another creature from their game. Will fired the gun, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. And then something even stranger happened. The wall behind the Demogorgon began to pulse and shift, like reality itself was tearing open. A gateway appeared, a rift between worlds, and the creature pulled Will through it. In an instant, Will Byers vanished from our world entirely. He tumbled through into the Upside Down, into that dark mirror dimension where Henry Creel waited. Will's bike was found the next morning in the woods, abandoned. His mother Joyce called the police. Chief Jim Hopper, a good man worn down by personal tragedy, began an investigation. Search parties formed. The entire town of Hawkins mobilized to find this missing boy. But Will wasn't in Hawkins anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold, running for his life through a twisted version of his own town, trying desperately to survive. The same week Will disappeared, something else happened at Hawkins' laboratory. Dr. Brenner had been continuing his experiments, pushing 11 harder than ever. She was now 12 years old, and her powers had grown immensely. Brenner had been training her for a specific purpose: to use her abilities for espionage, to spy on Soviet communications, to serve as a weapon in the Cold War. During one of these experiments, 11 encountered something she wasn't supposed to. Brenner had her use sensory deprivation. Floating in a tank of salt water, her consciousness extending beyond her body, to remotely observe a Russian facility. But while exploring this psychic space, she encountered something else. Something in the dark between worlds. She saw the Demogorgon, and in seeing it, in making that psychic contact, she created a connection. The creature became aware of her, and through her, aware of Hawkins. More than that, her psychic touch while in the sensory deprivation state created a crack in the barrier between dimensions. Not as dramatic as the one she'd made in 1979, but enough for the Demogorgon to push through, enough for it to enter Hawkins and hunt. 11 didn't understand what she'd done, but she knew something terrible had happened, and she knew Brenner would never let her leave the laboratory. So she did something she'd never done before. She ran. She escaped into the woods outside the facility, wearing only a hospital gown, her head still shaved, terrified and alone in a world she'd only ever seen through Brenner's filtered descriptions. It was raining. She was cold, hungry, disoriented. She found a diner and, using her powers, stole some food. The owner, Benny, found her, and rather than calling the authorities, he showed her kindness, gave her warm clothes, made her real food, treated her like a person rather than an experiment. It was the first genuine human kindness 11 had ever received from someone other than the numbered subjects in the laboratory, but it was short-lived. Brenner's agents found her, and in the chaos Benny was killed, made to look like a suicide. 11 fled again, back into the woods, back into the cold November rain. And that's where the boys found her. Mike, Lucas, and Dustin had been searching for Will on their own, convinced that the adults weren't looking in the right places. When they encountered this strange girl in the woods, soaking wet and terrified, Mike made a snap decision that would change everything. He brought her home. He hid her in his basement, gave her blankets and clothes, shared his frozen waffles with her. His friends were skeptical, even scared, especially when she demonstrated that she could move objects with her mind. But Mike saw something in her, a person who needed help, someone as lost as Will was. They named her Elle, a nickname from her number, and slowly, through their questions and her fragmentary answers, they began to understand that this girl with strange powers might be connected to Will's disappearance. While the boys were discovering 11, Joyce Byers was experiencing something that everyone else thought was a breakdown. Her son had vanished, and while the police searched and the town offered sympathies, Joyce knew something they didn't. Will was still alive, still trying to communicate. It started with the phone. It would ring, but when Joyce answered, there was only static, strange, modulated static that almost sounded like breathing, like someone trying to speak through interference. The phone company insisted it was just electrical problems. Chief Hopper thought Joyce was understandably distraught, but then the lights started flickering. And not just flickering randomly, they responded to Joyce. When she asked questions, they blinked in patterns. When she called Will's name, they flared brighter. Joyce Byers, working a dead-end job to support her 2 sons after her ex-husband abandoned them, had never considered herself particularly imaginative or special. But she knew her child, and she knew he was trying to reach her. So she did what any desperate mother would do. She turned her entire living room wall into a communication device. She bought Christmas lights, strings and strings of them, and hung them across her wall, each bulb labelled with a letter. She called out to Will, and the lights responded. Slowly, laboriously, Will spelled out messages. Righthere. He was right there, in the house somehow, but in a place she couldn't see or reach. To everyone else in Hawkins, Joyce Byers had lost her mind. Her ex-husband Lonnie showed up, pretending to care, really just looking for a lawsuit opportunity. Her older son, Jonathan, was worried sick about both his missing brother and his unraveling mother. Even Hopper, who wanted to believe her, struggled with what she was claiming. But Joyce didn't care what anyone thought. She knew Will was alive. She knew he was trapped somewhere, and she would tear apart reality itself if that's what it took to bring her boy home. As the search for Will Byers continued, the town of Hawkins divided into different factions, each pursuing their own version of the truth. Chief Jim Hopper led the official investigation, though he was starting to notice strange inconsistencies. State police were interfering. Hawkins' laboratory employees were being evasive, and the more he pushed, the more he was pushed back. Hopper was a good cop, but more than that, he was a broken man trying to find purpose. Years earlier, his daughter Sarah had died of cancer, and his marriage had collapsed under the weight of that grief. Finding Will Byers alive became, for Hopper, a chance at redemption. Jonathan Byers, Will's older brother, conducted his own search. He'd spent his life protecting Will from bullies and from their absent father's neglect. The guilt of not being there when Will disappeared ate at him. While photographing search party areas in the woods, Jonathan accidentally captured something on film. A figure, something strange and inhuman that shouldn't exist. Meanwhile, Nancy Wheeler, Mike's older sister, was dealing with her own crisis. Her best friend Barb had vanished the same night Will did, taken from the Harrington pool during a party Nancy had dragged her to. But unlike Will's disappearance, no one seemed to care much about Barb. She wasn't a little kid. She'd probably just run away. Except Nancy knew Barb would never do that. Nancy and Jonathan's investigations converged, drawn together by shared loss and strange evidence. They discovered that something in the woods was hunting. They found Demogorgon tracks, and eventually they found a portal, a tear in a tree trunk that led to somewhere else, somewhere that looked like Hawkins, but wasn't. The boys, meanwhile, were learning from 11. She tried to explain, with her limited vocabulary and traumatic memories, what had happened at the laboratory. She showed them on Mike's Dungeons and Dragons board. The board was their world, and she flipped it upside down, showing them the underneath. The Upside Down, Dustin named it, a place that existed beneath or alongside their world, dark and dangerous. 11 told them about the monster, the Demogorgon, and how she'd accidentally created a way for it to cross over. She told them about the bad men from the laboratory who were hunting for her. And most importantly, she told them she could find Will. Using her psychic abilities, she could locate him in the Upside Down. The Demogorgon wasn't mindless. It was predatory, intelligent in its own alien way, and it was hungry. It had crossed over into Hawkins through the gate 11's psychic contact had created, and now it hunted in both dimensions simultaneously, our world and the Upside Down, passing between them through temporary portals it could create. It took Barb Holland from the Harrington pool, dragging her into the Upside Down, where she died quickly, brutally. It stalked the woods, leaving behind traces of the other dimension, dead trees, strange organic matter, and unnatural coldness. Will Byers, meanwhile, was surviving. Somehow, this small 12-year-old boy was staying alive in a dimension designed to be hostile to human life. He hid in Castle Byers, a fort he'd built in the woods, in the real world that existed in degraded form in the Upside Down. He sang to himself, trying to stay warm and brave. He communicated with his mother through the lights, through the thin barrier between dimensions. But the Demogorgon was hunting him. Will could hear it, that terrible sound it made. He ran, hid, moved constantly. He was growing weaker, breathing in the toxic spores of the Upside Down, his body slowly being poisoned by that alien atmosphere. Back in Hawkins, the laboratory agents were closing in on 11. Dr. Brenner was obsessed with getting her back, both because she was his greatest success and because she was the key to understanding and potentially controlling the gate. He had no concern for Will Byers or Barb Holland. They were acceptable losses in the pursuit of his research. The tension escalated when Brenner's men cornered 11 and the boys at the middle school. Using her powers, 11 killed several agents and flipped an entire van through the air. It was the first time Mike and the others truly understood how powerful and how dangerous she could be. They escaped, but barely, and 11 was exhausted. Each time she used her powers, especially to hurt people, it drained something from her. The nosebleeds got worse. She grew paler, weaker. She was burning herself out, and everyone could see it. Using 11's abilities and a sensory deprivation tank rigged together by the boys in their middle school gym, they finally located Will. 11 psychically entered the Upside Down and found him in Castle Byers, barely alive, covered in some kind of tendril or vine that seemed to be attached to his body. Hopper and Joyce, who had independently broken into Hawkins' laboratory and discovered the gate, an actual physical tear into another dimension in the laboratory's basement, now knew where to go. The Upside Down was real. It existed on the other side of that gate, and their children were trapped there. The plan came together in fragments. Hopper and Joyce would go through the gate to rescue Will. Nancy and Jonathan would lure the Demogorgon to the Byers house and try to kill it, and the boys with 11 would stay hidden. But plans, especially ones involving terrified children and interdimensional monsters, rarely go smoothly. Nancy and Jonathan set a trap. They covered the Byers house in gasoline, set up a bear trap, armed themselves with weapons. When the Demogorgon came, they fought it, injured it, even set it on fire, but it was incredibly resilient, healing from wounds that should have killed it, adapting to their attacks. Meanwhile, in the Upside Down, Hopper and Joyce navigated the dark mirror version of Hawkins, searching desperately for Will. The environment itself seemed hostile. The air was poisonous. The vines moved with disturbing purpose, and everywhere they looked, they saw evidence of death. The organic matter covering everything wasn't just plant life. It was something alive, something that seemed to be digesting the very world around it. They found Will, finally, in Castle Byers, unconscious and barely breathing. The vine or tentacle attached to his mouth had pushed down into his throat, into his lungs. Hopper pulled it out, giving Will CPR, breathing life back into his small poisoned body. Joyce held her son, crying, and for a moment it seemed like everything might be okay. But they still had to get back through the gate with Will, back to our world, before the toxic atmosphere killed all three of them. The Demogorgon, wounded but far from defeated, tracked the boys and 11 to the middle school. Dr. Brenner and his agents surrounded the building. There was no escape, no help coming. The boys were trapped between the monster they'd been fighting and the government agents who saw them as loose ends. And then Brenner died. The Demogorgon, in its methodical hunting, killed him. The man who had started all of this, whose experiments had created both 11 and the gate that allowed monsters through. There was a kind of poetic justice in it, though the boys were too terrified to appreciate the irony. The creature cornered them in the school. Mike, Lucas, and Dustin tried to fight it with the weapons they'd cobbled together. Slingshots, pipes, anything they could find. But it was useless. This thing had survived being shot, burned, and trapped. What could 3 12-year-old boys do against it? 11 stepped forward. She was exhausted, having pushed her powers to the limit over the past week. Blood was running from her nose, from her ears. She could barely stand. But she put herself between the boys, between Mike and the monster. She told them to run. They refused. Mike grabbed her hand, told her they'd fight together. And in that moment, 11 understood something she'd never really known before. She wasn't alone. These boys, especially Mike, actually cared about her. Not for her powers, not for what she could do, but for who she was. That realization gave her strength. 11 unleashed everything she had left. The Demogorgon lunged at her, and she caught it mid-air with her mind, held it suspended and screaming. The creature was immensely strong, fighting back against her psychic grip. The walls of the school began to crack. The lights exploded. Dust and debris swirled around them like a hurricane. And then 11 did something impossible. She didn't just kill the Demogorgon, she disintegrated it, tore it apart at a molecular level, scattered it across dimensions. Both she and the creature began to dissolve into particles of light and shadow. The boys screamed her name. Mike reached for her, but it was too late. In a flash of light, both 11 and the Demogorgon vanished. When the dust settled, the boys stood alone in the ruined classroom, crying. Mike collapsed to his knees, where 11 had been standing, finding nothing but empty space. She was gone. Will Byers was found alive, a miracle that the town of Hawkins celebrated with relief and confusion. The official story was vague. He'd been lost in the woods, had survived through luck and determination. No one outside a small group knew the truth about the Upside Down, about monsters, about little girls with superpowers. Barb Holland's disappearance remained officially unsolved, a fact that haunted Nancy Wheeler and would continue to haunt her. Her best friend was dead, and Nancy hadn't been able to save her. Hopper made a deal with the government agents who cleaned up the mess. He would stay quiet about what happened, wouldn't expose the laboratory's crimes, in exchange for protecting the kids and being kept in the loop about any future incidents. It wasn't a good deal, but it was the best he could manage. The boys tried to return to normal life. They went back to school, played D&D, acted like everything was fine. But Mike kept Elle's blanket in his basement, slept next to it every night. He put food in a box in the woods each week, just in case she was out there, lost and hungry. Lucas and Dustin worried about their friend, but they didn't know how to help him. And Will seemed fine. He was home with his mother and brother, seeing doctors, recovering from his ordeal. He smiled, he talked about what happened, the parts he was allowed to talk about. He seemed like himself. But on Christmas Eve, when he excused himself from dinner and went to the bathroom, something happened. He looked in the mirror, and for just a moment, reality flickered. He saw the Upside Down, the dark reflection of the bathroom, the writhing vines, the toxic air, and he felt something inside himself, something that shouldn't be there. Then it passed. He was back in the normal bathroom, normal Hawkins, normal life. Will splashed water on his face and went back to his family, saying nothing. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, he knew the truth. The Upside Down wasn't done with him, and somewhere in the woods outside Hawkins, in the space between dimensions, 11 drifted. She wasn't dead. Not exactly. But she wasn't entirely in our world anymore either. She'd saved her friends, defeated the monster, and now she was lost in the dark, trying to find her way home. Nearly a year passed. The boys were in 8th grade now. Mike was distant, still mourning 11 and trying to maintain contact through a walkie-talkie he spoke into every night, sending messages he knew probably went nowhere. Lucas had started dating Max Mayfield, a new girl from California with bright red hair and a talent for skateboarding. Dustin had returned from science camp with exciting news about a new girlfriend named Susie, though no one had actually met her, and his friends were starting to suspect she might not be real. And Will was seeing things. It started small, flickers of the other place, moments where reality seemed to overlay with that dark dimension. His mother chalked it up to PTSD, insisted he see doctors and therapists. But Will knew it was more than that. The visions were getting stronger, lasting longer. He was seeing things that weren't there, or maybe they were there, but in a place adjacent to ours. One day, during one of these episodes, Will saw something massive, something in the sky of the Upside Down, like a storm cloud, but not, a vast shadow with lightning crackling through it, with tentacles or appendages reaching down. It saw him, and in being seen, Will felt its presence enter him. This was the Mind Flayer, that ancient entity Henry Creel had discovered in the Upside Down, and it had found a way to reach into our world through Will Byers, who still carried traces of the other dimension inside him from his time there. The possession began slowly. Will would lose time, black out for minutes or hours. He would wake up in strange places with no memory of how he got there, and he began to draw, compulsively, obsessively, sprawling maps of tunnels that spread beneath Hawkins like the roots of some enormous organism, because that's what they were. The Mind Flayer wasn't just reaching through with its consciousness, it was literally growing into Hawkins, spreading a network of tunnels and vines beneath the town, connecting to its physical environment the way fungus spreads through soil. Joyce realized something was terribly wrong. So did Hopper, who had become a protective figure in Will's life. They took him to Hawkins' laboratory, now under new management, Dr. Brenner presumably dead, where scientists tried to help, but they didn't understand what they were dealing with. The Mind Flayer wasn't just possessing Will, it was learning from him. It was understanding our world, our weaknesses, our weapons, and it was preparing. On the same night Will was fighting off visions of the Mind Flayer, Mike Wheeler heard something impossible. A voice on his walkie-talkie, a voice he'd been listening for every single night for 353 days. Mike, it's me. 11 was alive. What Mike didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was where she'd been. After the fight with the Demogorgon, 11 had been pulled into the Upside Down, caught between dimensions. She'd wandered that dark place, weak and lost, until she found a temporary gate, a crack in reality, and pulled herself through back into Hawkins. She'd emerged in the woods, alone and exhausted, and that's where Hopper found her. For the past year, Hopper had been hiding 11 in a cabin in the woods, protecting her from the government agents who still wanted to capture her. He'd taught her basic things, reading, writing, how to heat up Eggo waffles in the toaster oven. He'd become, in his gruff and traumatized way, the father figure she'd never had. But Elle had been trapped. For her safety, Hopper insisted she stay hidden, never leave the cabin, never risk being seen. For a girl who had just escaped one prison, this felt unbearably like another. She'd broken Hopper's rules, used her powers to spy on Mike through the TV, watched him calling for her every night, and it broke her heart that she couldn't respond. Now, with the Mind Flayer active and danger escalating, Hopper finally allowed her to make contact. The reunion between Elle and Mike was everything you'd imagine. Tears holding each other, Mike telling her he called out every night, Elle telling him she heard. The other boys welcomed her back with joy and relief. Even Max, initially suspicious, recognized that whatever this strange, powerful girl was, she was family to these boys. But there was no time for celebration. Will was in danger. The Mind Flayer was growing stronger. And beneath Hawkins, the tunnel system was spreading, preparing for something terrible. The scientists at Hawkins' laboratory, now led by Dr. Sam Owens, a good man genuinely trying to fix Brenner's mistakes, discovered the tunnel system beneath the town. Hopper volunteered to explore it, to map it out, and understand what they were dealing with. What he found was nightmarish. Miles of tunnels, all covered in the same organic matter from the Upside Down, all connected like a massive neural network, and at the centre, a hub, a sort of brain or central node where all the tunnels converged. The entire system was alive, pulsing, growing. Hopper got trapped down there, infected by spores, lost in the maze. Joyce had to mount a rescue mission, navigating the tunnels with Bob Newby, her sweet, goofy boyfriend who worked at Radio Shack and loved weird movies and making Joyce smile. They found Hopper, delirious from spore infection. They made it to a laboratory access point, and then Bob made a choice that would haunt everyone who survived. The facility was under attack by demodogs, smaller, younger versions of the Demogorgon that operated in packs like wolves. To unlock the doors and let Joyce and Hopper escape with the kids, Bob had to reset the breakers manually. He did it. He saved them all. And as he ran back towards safety, the Demodogs caught him. Joyce watched through a window as the man who had brought lightness into her life was torn apart by monsters. Meanwhile, the Mind Flayer was completing its possession of Will. It could see through his eyes now, control his actions, speak through his mouth. When the scientists interrogated Will, trying to learn about the Mind Flayer's weaknesses, the entity lied through him, tricked them, used Will to lead soldiers into an ambush in the tunnels where Demodogs slaughtered them. Joyce made a desperate decision. If the Mind Flayer was inside Will because he was connected to the Upside Down's cold atmosphere, maybe extreme heat could drive it out. They took Will to Hopper's cabin, turned the heat up as high as it would go, and essentially tried to cook the entity out of her son. It was agonizing. Will screamed. The Mind Flayer fought back, trying to kill him rather than leave, but Joyce held her son and told him to fight, to remember who he was, to come back to her. And slowly, painfully, Will pushed the entity out. But that still left the problem of the tunnels, the Demodogs, and the growing gate in the basement of Hawkins' laboratory that was allowing more of the Upside Down to bleed into our world. The plan came together from multiple sources. Nancy and Jonathan had travelled to meet with a journalist, exposed some of Hawkins' laboratory's crimes, created political pressure. Steve Harrington, Nancy's ex-boyfriend, who had proven himself surprisingly capable in a crisis, was protecting the younger kids. Dr. Owens was coordinating with military forces to contain the upside-down incursion. But the real key was 11. She had spent the past year not just hiding, but training. She'd been practicing her abilities, pushing her powers further than ever before. And she'd made a journey to Chicago to find her sister, another numbered subject from the laboratory, number 8, who had escaped years ago. 8 had taught Elle something important. Anger made her stronger. Rage could fuel her abilities. But Elle had ultimately rejected 8's path of revenge, realizing that she fought not for hatred but for love, for Mike, for Hopper, for her friends. Now, as the situation in Hawkins reached crisis point, Elle returned. She walked into the laboratory, past the soldiers and scientists, with Hopper at her side. She'd come to do what only she could do, close the gate. The portal was enormous now, a rift in reality big enough to drive a truck through. On the other side, the Upside Down was visible, a writhing mass of vines and darkness, with the shadow of the Mind Flayer looming huge in the distance. Elle stood before it, gathering her strength. Mike, watching from a safe distance through laboratory cameras, spoke to her through a walkie-talkie. He told her what she'd told him before, that she could do this, that she was strong enough. 11 raised her hands and pushed. It wasn't easy. The gate fought her, or more accurately, the Mind Flayer fought her. That vast entity on the other side, pressed against her psychic force, tried to keep its connection to our world open. Blood poured from Elle's nose, from her ears. She screamed with the effort, but she didn't stop. She thought about Mike, about the boys, about Hopper who'd become her dad, about Joyce's kindness, about having a home, and people who cared whether she lived or died. She thought about all of that, and she pushed harder. The gate began to close. The edges of the rift pulled together like a wound healing. The Mind Flayer roared, a sound that echoed across dimensions. Its shadow form lunged forward, trying to push through at the last second. But it was too late. With a final scream of effort, 11 sealed the gate completely. The rift in reality closed. The connection between Hawkins and the Upside Down was severed. Elle collapsed. Hopper caught her. For a moment, no one knew if she'd survive. She'd pushed herself further than ever before. But slowly, her eyes opened. She was exhausted, broken, but alive. The crisis was over. The tunnels beneath Hawkins began to die, the organic matter drying up and withering. The Demodogs collapsed. Will was himself again, free of the Mind Flayer's influence. Hawkins had been saved. A month later, the middle school held its winter dance, the Snowball. For the kids who had spent the past year fighting monsters and government conspiracies, it was a chance to be normal teenagers, even if just for one night. Hopper had officially become Elle's guardian through some creative paperwork from Dr. Owens. She could go to school now, have a normal life. And for the Snowball, Hopper helped her get ready, even teaching her an awkward dance in their cabin before they left. Mike waited for her at the dance, nervous in a way he never was when facing demodogs. When Elle walked in wearing a dress, her hair grown out, looking like a regular girl instead of an experiment or a weapon, Mike's face lit up with pure joy. They danced. They were 13 years old, and the world was safe. And for that moment, everything was perfect. Lucas and Max were there, officially, a couple now. Dustin tried to ask girls to dance and got rejected, until Nancy Wheeler, understanding what it felt like to be dismissed, kindly offered to dance with him. Will was there with his friends, finally able to just be a kid. The camera pulled back, showing all of them in the decorated gym, slow dancing to sentimental 80s music, surrounded by paper snowflakes and twinkling lights. It was sweet, it was innocent, it was everything they deserved after the nightmares they'd endured. But as the camera continued pulling back, through the roof of the school, into the sky above Hawkins, up into the clouds, we saw something the kids couldn't see. In the upside down, still existing in its parallel dimension, even though the gate was closed, the Mind Flayer loomed. Its shadow form towered over the dark mirror version of Hawkins, massive and watchful. It was still there, still aware, and it was looking directly at our world, directly at Hawkins, with something that looked very much like focused intention. The gate might be closed, but the Mind Flayer wasn't done with Hawkins, not by a long shot. The summer of 1985 was supposed to be perfect. The kids were going into high school. The Starcourt Mall had just opened, a gleaming temple of capitalism and 80s excess with a food court, an arcade, a movie theatre, and dozens of stores selling everything teenagers could want. Mike and Elle were officially dating, spending every possible moment together to the point where Hopper felt like a third wheel in his own home. Lucas and Max were in an on-again, off-again relationship with all the drama that implied. Dustin returned from science camp with exciting news. He'd met a genius girlfriend named Susie, who definitely existed, he insisted, and he'd built a sophisticated radio tower on a hill to maintain long-distance communication with her. Will felt increasingly left behind. His friends were all interested in dating now, in girls and relationships, while Will just wanted to play D&D and have things go back to how they were. He wasn't ready for everyone to grow up, wasn't ready for childhood to end, and Steve Harrington graduated and without college plans was working at Scoops Ahoy ice cream parlour in the mall, alongside Robin Buckley, a band geek with a sharp wit who delighted in keeping score of how many times Steve struck out with girls. Everything seemed normal, perfect even, except it wasn't. Dustin's radio tower picked up something unusual, a Russian transmission, encoded and clearly secret. Being Dustin, he immediately recruited Steve and Robin to help translate it. What they discovered was alarming. The Russians were operating a secret base somewhere in Hawkins, and their mission seemed to involve something called the Key. At the same time, strange things were happening around town. Rats were gathering in unusual numbers, acting strangely, almost like they were being controlled. People were getting sick. Mrs. Driscoll, an elderly woman, attacked a hospital worker and started eating chemicals. Max's stepbrother, Billy Hargrove, the town bully who worked as a lifeguard at the community pool, was involved in a car accident and started behaving erratically afterward. These seemed like separate problems, but they weren't. The Russians had built a massive facility beneath the Starcourt Mall, and they were attempting to reopen the gate to the Upside Down. They'd learned about Eleven's ability to create portals and were trying to replicate it technologically. Their laser drill was designed to bore through reality itself, to tear open a new gate. And the Mind Flayer, still aware and watching from the other side, was ready. It couldn't reach through directly. 11 had closed the gate too completely, but it could send pieces of itself through the small cracks and fissures the Russian machine was creating. These fragments of the Mind Flayer took the form of small sludge-like creatures that possessed people and rats, slowly building an army. Billy Hargrove was one of the first humans to be taken. After his accident, a piece of the Mind Flayer entered him, took control. He was still Billy on the outside, but inside, he was gone, replaced by something else, something that began recruiting more hosts, creating more flayed people, human shells controlled by the Mind Flayer's consciousness. Elle, Mike, and their friends began investigating the strange behaviour of Mrs. Driscoll and others. Using Elle's powers, they tracked the flayed to Billy and devised a test. If the Mind Flayer preferred cold and hated heat, as they'd learned from Will's possession, then extreme heat should hurt anyone who was flayed. They lured Billy to the pool sauna and trapped him inside, cranking the heat up. Billy screamed and begged, pretending to be himself, pulling at Mike's sympathies. But Elle knew better. She turned the heat higher, and Billy's true nature revealed itself. Something dark and wrong looking out through his eyes, something that spoke with the Mind Flayer's voice, promising it would kill all of them. They barely escaped. Billy, incredibly strong under the Mind Flayer's control, nearly killed Elle before she used her powers to throw him back. The group realized they were dealing with a coordinated threat, multiple flayed people working together, all controlled by a single intelligence. Meanwhile, Dustin, Steve, Robin, and a younger kid named Erica Sinclair, Lucas's brilliant, confident little sister, discovered the Russian base beneath the mall. They infiltrated it, found the massive drill attempting to open the gate, and realized the scope of what they were facing. These weren't just a few Russian spies. This was a full military operation. Dozens of soldiers and scientists, all hidden beneath the American heartland. They were captured. Steve and Robin were drugged, interrogated, tortured, but they didn't break. And eventually, with Dustin and Erica's help, they escaped, though not before learning that the Russians were close to achieving their goal. The gate was nearly open. The Mind Flayer, sensing success, began the next phase of its plan. All the flayed people, Billy, Mrs. Driscoll, dozens of others, gathered at the old Brimborn Steelworks. And there, in a scene of body horror that would haunt everyone who witnessed it, they melted. Their bodies liquefied and merged together, forming something new. The Mind Flayer didn't just possess people, it could use their biomass, their physical substance, to build itself a body in our world. From the melted remains of its hosts, it created a massive creature, part spider, part machine, with tentacles and claws and a mouthful of teeth. A monster the size of a building, made from the dissolved bodies of Hawkins' residents. And it came for 11. Everything converged on July 4th at the Starcourt Mall. Joyce and Hopper, having pursued their own investigation with the help of conspiracy theorist Murray Bauman, fought their way into the Russian facility under the mall. Their mission: destroy the drill, close the gate before it fully opened, cut off the Mind Flayer's connection. Nancy, Jonathan, and the kids were at the mall level, trying to fend off the Mind Flayer's monster form. It stalked them through the corridors and stores, smashing through walls, impossibly fast and strong. Elle tried to fight it with her powers, but something was wrong. Her abilities weren't working properly. When the Mind Flayer had attacked her earlier, it had bitten her, injecting some part of itself into her leg. Now that piece of the Mind Flayer was inside her, moving under her skin, blocking her powers. In a scene of visceral horror, Elle used a broken tile to cut open her own leg, and then with her wavering telekinesis, pulled the writhing, organic piece of the Mind Flayer out of herself. It was agonizing, traumatic, but necessary. But she was still weakened, still mostly powerless when they needed her most. The Russian facility was chaos. Hopper and Joyce fought through soldiers, finally reaching the control room. Joyce was at the controls, ready to destroy the drill and close the gate. But doing so would mean leaving Hopper trapped on the wrong side of an explosion. He told her to do it anyway, to close the gate, save the kids, save the town. At the mall, the Mind Flayer's monster had cornered everyone. It was about to kill them all when Billy appeared, still flayed, still controlled, but fighting it. Max, his stepsister, who he'd tormented for years, spoke to him, reached for whatever tiny spark of Billy Hargrove still existed inside the meat puppet. She reminded him of who he was, of one good memory from his childhood, the day before his mother left, before his father's abuse broke him, when he was happy at the beach in California. Something in Billy responded. Some fragment of his original consciousness pushed back against the Mind Flayer's control. He placed himself between the monster and the kids, holding it off with his own body. The Mind Flayer struck at him, impaling him with one of its tendrils, then another, then more. Billy died protecting the kids he'd once terrorized, making one good choice at the very end. And at that exact moment, Joyce turned the keys. The machine exploded. The gate snapped shut. The Mind Flayer's monster, cut off from its power source, collapsed. The organic matter that formed it dried up and died. The battle was over. But when the smoke cleared, when Joyce made it to the platform where Hopper should have been, he wasn't there. Just smoking wreckage, electrical fires, and no sign of the man who had been standing there moments before. Jim Hopper was gone, and Elle, who had just started to think of him as her dad, who had been planning to hear the speech he'd written for her, lost him. 3 months later, the Byers family packed their belongings into a moving truck. Hawkins held too many painful memories: Bob's death, Will's repeated traumas, the constant danger. Joyce decided they needed a fresh start somewhere else. They were moving to California, and Elle was going with them. Joyce had become her legal guardian after Hopper's death. Elle would have a chance at a normal life, away from the dangers of Hawkins, away from the government scrutiny that never quite went away. Mike helped her pack up the cabin she'd shared with Hopper. They found the speech he'd written for her, about growing up and change and how proud he was of her. Elle couldn't read it without crying. At the Byers' house, the whole group gathered to say goodbye. Mike and Elle promised they'd visit, would call, would maintain their relationship long distance. Lucas and Max were there. Dustin was there. Steve showed up. Even Nancy and Jonathan, now a couple, came to see the Byers off. It was the end of something. Not just the end of Elle's time in Hawkins, but the end of an era. The end of childhood, really. They'd fought monsters together, but now real life was pulling them apart in ways monsters never could. Before they left, Will made one final gesture. He gave his D&D manuals to a younger kid, passing on the game that had meant so much to him. It was an acknowledgement that this chapter was over, that he was leaving Hawkins and everything it represented behind. The moving truck pulled away. Mike and Elle watched each other through the windows until distance made them just shapes, then specks, then nothing. But the story wasn't over. In Russia, in a gulag prison camp, guards walked through snow to a cell block. They selected a prisoner, not the American, one said, and led him away. In an underground chamber, they faced him toward a demogorgon they had somehow captured, somehow kept alive. The Russian experiments weren't over. They might have lost their facility in Hawkins, but they still had samples from the Upside Down, and they still had one valuable prisoner. Somewhere in that frozen camp, Jim Hopper was alive. 6 months after leaving Hawkins, life in California wasn't going well for Elle. She'd lost her powers. Ever since closing the gate and exhausting herself, her abilities simply wouldn't return. She concentrated, tried to move objects, tried to connect psychically to Mike back in Hawkins, but nothing happened. She was just a normal girl now, except she'd never learned how to be a normal girl. School was a nightmare. Elle was genuinely trying to fit in and make friends, but she didn't understand the social dynamics, the unwritten rules. A girl named Angela seemed friendly at first, but it was all mockery. Angela and her friends bullied Elle relentlessly, made fun of her clothes, her awkwardness, the way she talked. Elle couldn't defend herself. not without powers, not without knowing how to navigate teenage cruelty. She wrote letters to Mike, painting a picture of California life that was much brighter than reality. She told him about friends she didn't really have, adventures that were mostly imagined. She couldn't bear for him to know how badly she was struggling. Will wasn't faring much better. He was trying to figure out who he was, dealing with feelings he couldn't quite name or express. He painted compulsively, including a beautiful piece showing a knight in armour and a dragon, though who the figures really represented, he kept to himself. He watched Mike and Elle's relationship with a complicated mixture of support and heartache. Jonathan had found a stoner friend named Argyle who worked at a pizza place. It was easier to stay high and avoid thinking about how much he missed Nancy, who was back in Hawkins pursuing journalism at the school paper. Joyce was working multiple jobs, trying to keep the family afloat. She worried constantly about all of them, but felt powerless to fix what was broken. And then Mike came to visit for spring break, ready to surprise Elle with a declaration of love he'd been too scared to make before. But when he arrived and saw the reality of Elle's life, the bullying, the loneliness, the lies she'd been telling, everything got complicated. Meanwhile, across the world in Russia, Jim Hopper was alive, but barely. He'd survived the explosion by diving through a gate into the Upside Down, then back out through another crack the Russians had created. They'd captured him, thrown him in a gulag labour camp, worked him nearly to death in the freezing Kamchatka cold. Hopper had one thought keeping him alive: getting back to Elle and Joyce. He didn't know if they thought he was dead. He didn't know if they'd moved on. But he couldn't die in this frozen hell without trying to get home. Back in Hawkins, something new was hunting. Chrissy Cunningham, head cheerleader and picture-perfect student, was struggling with demons no one could see. Her mother's emotional abuse, her eating disorder, her need to be perfect, it was crushing her. She was experiencing terrible visions, seeing things that couldn't be real. Desperate, she reached out to an unlikely source for help: Eddie Munson, the town metalhead and leader of the Hellfire Club D&D group, who had a reputation for selling drugs. Chrissy went to Eddie's trailer to buy something to help her sleep, to quiet the nightmares. But before any transaction could happen, she froze. Her eyes rolled back. She rose into the air as if lifted by invisible hands. Eddie watched in horror as her bones began to break, one by one, her arms bending backward at the elbows, her legs snapping at the knees, her jaw dislocated, her eyes collapsed inward. Then she dropped, dead, to the floor of Eddie's trailer. Eddie ran. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew how it looked, him alone with a dead girl, her body impossibly broken. The town would blame him. So he fled to a boathouse and hid, terrified and alone. Days later, another victim, Fred Benson, a student at the school newspaper. Then another, Patrick McKinney, a basketball player. Each death was the same, the victim entering a trance, floating into the air, bones breaking, eyes collapsing. The town of Hawkins was in a panic. A satanic killer was on the loose, they said. And Eddie Munson, with his long hair and Metallica shirts and devil-worshipping D&D club, was the obvious suspect. But Dustin, Steve, Robin, Nancy, and Max knew better. They'd seen supernatural threats before. This had all the hallmarks of something from the Upside Down. Max was particularly affected. She'd been struggling since Billy's death, consumed by guilt over their complicated relationship. She'd written Billy a letter she could never send, processing her grief and rage at him, at herself, at how unfair everything was. And then she started having the visions too, seeing Billy's corpse, seeing her own death, seeing a grandfather clock that appeared in impossible places. They realized the pattern. All the victims had been experiencing trauma, depression, guilt. Whatever was killing them was targeting people who were already broken inside, people carrying heavy emotional burdens. It was feeding on their pain, their guilt, their worst memories. And a new name entered their vocabulary: Vecna. Named after a D&D villain, this entity was reaching from the upside down into the minds of traumatized teenagers, showing them their worst fears and then crushing them from within. Max was next. She was on Vecna's list, and they had very little time to save her. Nancy and Robin investigated Vecna's origins, following leads to the old Creel house, the same Victorian mansion where the murders had occurred in 1959. The house had sat abandoned for decades, a local legend of horror that most people avoided. Inside they found evidence of the past, old furniture, bloodstains, the memories of violence, and as they explored, Vecna found them. Nancy was pulled into a vision, trapped in her own mind. Vecna showed her the deaths of Barb, of the other victims, made her relive her guilt. He revealed himself to her, not as a monster, but as a person, or what used to be a person. He told her his story, how he was Henry Creel, how he'd killed his family, how he'd been trapped in the laboratory as Subject 1, how 11 had banished him to the Upside Down, where he'd transformed into something more than human, how he'd spent years in that dimension, learning to control it, bending it to his will. Vecna explained his philosophy, that humanity was a plague of pretense and weakness, that he was bringing truth through death, that he was opening gates between dimensions to let reality bleed through. Each person he killed created a rift, a small gate, and when he had enough gates, when 4 souls had been sacrificed, he could tear reality apart entirely. He could bring the Upside Down into our world permanently. Nancy managed to break free of the vision, escaping back to consciousness. But she'd learned something crucial. Vecna was Henry Creel, the first child with powers, 11's predecessor, and he had a plan that would destroy not just Hawkins, but potentially everything. Back in California, Elle was dealing with her own crisis. During the spring break visit, Angela's bullying had escalated to public humiliation at a skating rink. Elle, pushed past her limit, had struck Angela with a roller skate, a very human reaction without powers to defend herself. But it looked bad, really bad. The police came. Elle was arrested, and then something stranger happened. Military vehicles arrived, and Elle was taken into custody by people who claimed to be working with Dr. Sam Owens. They told her the truth. Hawkins was under attack again. People were dying, and they needed her powers to stop it. The problem was, she didn't have powers anymore. Dr. Owens had a solution, but it was risky. They could potentially restore her abilities, but it would require Elle to undergo experimental treatment, specifically to relive her memories through sensory deprivation, to reconnect with her past, including the day she'd banished Henry Creel. Elle agreed. She had to. Her friends were in danger. In Hawkins, Max's time was running out. The visions were getting worse, longer, more detailed. Vecna was showing her Billy's death, making her relive her guilt and anger, pulling her consciousness away from the real world and toward him. The group discovered something crucial. Music could break Vecna's hold. Specific music, songs that held deep emotional meaning for the victim, could create a tether back to reality. For Max, that song was Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush, a song about wanting to swap places with someone, to understand their pain, that perfectly captured her relationship with Billy. They got her a Walkman, loaded with the tape. When Vecna took her, when Max entered the trance rising into the air in the graveyard where Billy was buried, they played the song. In the vision, Max was in Vecna's realm, a nightmare version of the Creel house. Vecna approached her, his burned and twisted form towering over her. He began to consume her memories, to feast on her trauma. She could feel her bones beginning to crack, but then she heard it. The music, Kate Bush's voice, ethereal and urgent, cutting through the nightmare. Max ran. She fled through the twisted corridors of Vecna's realm, following the sound of the song. Behind her, Vecna pursued, reality cracking and breaking in his wake. She found a portal, a rift that led back to the real world, glowing with red light. Her friends were visible through it, standing in the graveyard, holding the Walkman. calling her name. Max sprinted for it, Vecna's clawed hand reaching for her. She made it through, just in time. Back in the real world, she collapsed into Lucas's arms, gasping and crying. She was alive, but barely. They'd learned something important. Vecna could be fought. His control wasn't absolute. Music, memories, love, these things could break his hold. But Max couldn't live with her Walkman on forever. Eventually, Vecna would come for her again. They needed a permanent solution. They needed to kill him. In a secret facility in Nevada, Elle underwent the Nina Project, a sensory deprivation program designed to help her access her suppressed memories and hopefully restore her powers. She floated in the tank, her mind drifting back through her childhood at Hawkins' lab. She relived the tests, the punishments, Dr. Brenner's manipulations, and she remembered the other children, not just as victims, but as people. 2 who could see glimpses of the future. 5 who could make people see things that weren't there. 7 whose powers she never fully understood before he died. She remembered the orderly, Peter, who had been kind to her. She remembered removing the chip from his neck, thinking she was helping him escape. And then she relived the massacre, but this time, with adult understanding, she saw it clearly. The orderly wasn't Peter. He was Henry Creel. He was Subject 1, and he'd manipulated her, used her innocence to free himself, then slaughtered everyone she'd ever known. Elle watched through her 8-year-old eyes as Henry killed the children, one by one. She felt the terror of that day, the realization of what she'd unleashed, and she remembered fighting back, reaching for power she didn't know she had, opening the gate and banishing him. But she also remembered something Dr. Brenner had hidden from her. After Henry was gone, Brenner had blamed Elle for all the deaths. He'd told her she'd killed everyone, that her rage had caused the massacre. It was a lie, a manipulation to keep her guilty and controllable. But Elle had believed it for years, carrying that false burden. Now, understanding the truth, Elle felt her power return. Not just return, surge back stronger than ever. She'd been blocking herself because of the false guilt, the belief that her power only destroyed. But that wasn't true. She'd used her power to stop a monster, to protect herself. That was allowed. That was right. Elle emerged from the tank with her abilities fully restored and a new understanding of who she was. Not Brenner's experiment, not Henry's victim. Herself, Jane Hopper, who had survived impossible things and was still fighting. Meanwhile, across the world, Joyce received a package, a strange Russian doll that contained a hidden message. It was from Hopper. He was alive, imprisoned in Kamchatka, and he needed help. Joyce, Murray, and a smuggler named Yuri embarked on a desperate rescue mission to Russia, racing against time to save the man Joyce had thought was dead. Everything converged in those final days of March 1986. In Russia, Joyce and Murray fought through the Gulag, freed Hopper and other prisoners, and faced down a Demogorgon the Russians had been keeping captive. Hopper, armed with a sword and sheer desperation, killed the creature, finally getting revenge on the monsters that had destroyed his life. They escaped Russia with minutes to spare, heading home. In Nevada, Elle psychically connected to Max back in Hawkins, preparing to protect her friend when Vecna made his final move. Mike had joined her there, having finally told her he loved her, not when things were easy, but when they were hard. That love gave Elle strength, and in Hawkins, the remaining group split into 2 teams with a desperate plan. Team 1, Steve, Nancy, and Robin, would enter the Upside Down through a gate in the trailer park, created when Eddie's neighbour had been killed, navigate to the Creel house in that dimension, and attack Vecna's physical form while he was distracted. Team 2, Dustin and Eddie, would create a diversion, drawing the Demobats, flying creatures that swarmed in the Upside Down, away from the Creel house so the others could get through. Team 3, Lucas and Erica, would stay with Max in the real world while she offered herself as bait, letting Vecna into her mind so he'd be vulnerable to attack. It was an insane plan. but it was all they had. Eddie and Dustin played Master of Puppets by Metallica on amplified guitars in the Upside Down, a sound loud and aggressive enough to draw every demobat for miles. It worked too well. The creatures swarmed them. Eddie and Dustin fled back through the gate to safety, but Eddie made a choice. He saw the bats starting to slip through, heading toward the real world where innocent people lived. He went back, cut the rope, sealed himself in the Upside Down to keep the monsters contained. Dustin screamed for him to come back. Eddie smiled. This was his chance to be a hero, to be more than the town freak. He fought the demobats with trash can lids and a spear, buying precious minutes. They overwhelmed him, biting, clawing. Dustin managed to get back through and reached Eddie as he was dying. Eddie told Dustin he'd finally graduated, from coward to hero, and then he was gone. In the Creel house, Nancy, Steve and Robin found Vecna's body suspended in vines and organic matter, vulnerable while his consciousness was occupied. They shot him, threw Molotov cocktails, set him on fire. Vecna screamed, his concentration breaking, and Max, in her mind, felt Vecna's hold weaken. She ran again, trying to escape his realm, but this time Vecna was faster. Angrier, he caught her, lifted her, and began to break her. In the real world, Max's body rose into the air. Her bones started to snap. Arms, legs, ribs. Lucas screamed, trying to reach her. Elle, watching psychically from Nevada, fought with everything she had to push Vecna back, to save her friend. But she was too late. Max's eyes collapsed. She dropped to the ground, dead. Lucas held her, crying, begging her to wake up. And in those terrible moments, 4 gates opened, huge cracks in reality, spreading from each of Vecna's kill sites, converging on the centre of Hawkins. The earth shook. Buildings collapsed. The Upside Down began bleeding through into our world. Elle refused to accept it. She reached for Max's consciousness, found it drifting away, and pulled it back. She restarted Max's heart through sheer psychic force, dragged her friend's soul back from wherever it had gone. Max's heart began beating again. She was alive, but she didn't wake up. She was in a coma, her mind empty, her eyes gone. Elle had saved her life, but couldn't restore her consciousness, and Vecna, though burned and damaged, had escaped. He'd fallen through the Creel house into the depths of the Upside Down. The gates were open. His plan, while not complete, had succeeded enough. Hawkins was cracked open, and the barrier between worlds was shattered. The town of Hawkins reeled from what they thought was an earthquake. Dozens were dead. Hundreds were injured. The 4 massive cracks running through the town were inexplicable, not following fault lines, too precise to be natural. People evacuated. The government moved in. Hawkins became a disaster zone. Eddie Munson died a hero, but was remembered as a villain. The town still blamed him for the murders, never knowing he'd given his life to save them. Max lay in a coma at the hospital, her body healing, but her mind still gone somewhere Elle couldn't reach. Lucas sat with her every day, talking to her, playing her favourite music, hoping she could hear him. The group reunited, Mike and Elle back from Nevada, Will and Jonathan and Argyle arriving from California, Joyce and Hopper returning from Russia. The joy of Hopper's return was tempered by the devastation around them. This wasn't a victory. It was a pause before something worse. Hawkins was dying. The gates were spreading slowly, killing vegetation, creating dead zones, and through the cracks they could see it, the Upside Down, visible from our world now, red lightning crackling in the distance. In the final moments, the camera pulled up, showing the group standing together, looking at the gates, at the dying town, at the storm clouds, gathering. Will touched his neck, the place where the mind flayer had once connected to him, and felt it again, that cold sensation, that presence. "He's here," Will said quietly. "I can feel him, and he's not going to stop, not ever." The clouds parted slightly, and in the distance, silhouetted against red lightning, a massive shadow moved. The mind flayer larger than buildings, than anything natural, waiting in the upside down, watching. And somewhere in that dark dimension, Vecna, Henry Creel, pulled himself together, his burned body already beginning to heal. He'd lost the battle, but the war was far from over. 2 years would pass before the end truly came. The group tried to return to normal life, but Hawkins wasn't Hawkins anymore. The gates continued spreading, slowly but inevitably. The dead zones expanded. Strange occurrences became common. Flickers of the other dimension, creatures occasionally slipping through, cold spots where reality felt thin. Many residents left town. Those who stayed either didn't believe the danger or had nowhere else to go. The government maintained that it was all environmental fallout from the earthquake, nothing more. Elle searched desperately for a way to close the gates permanently, to seal the upside down away forever. But her powers, while restored, weren't enough on their own. She'd need help, from her friends, from understanding exactly what Vecna had done and how to undo it. Max remained in a coma through all of this. The doctors said she was stable, but there was no brain activity they could measure. Her body breathed, her heart beat, but whatever made her Max was still missing. Elle visited her often, sitting by her bedside, apologizing for not being fast enough, for not saving her in time. Will's connection to the upside down grew stronger. He could sense Vecna's presence, feel the Mind Flayer's plans taking shape. He became an early warning system. Whenever something was about to happen, Will knew it first, but it also meant he was never truly free of that dimension, never truly safe. Mike and Elle's relationship deepened, became something more mature than the puppy love of middle school. They'd faced death together, saved each other countless times. Lucas stayed devoted to Max, talking to her every day, refusing to give up hope. Dustin carried Eddie's memory, trying to clear his friend's name. Steve, Robin, Nancy, Jonathan, they all prepared in their own ways for what they knew was coming, because Vecna wasn't done. He was planning something bigger than before. He'd learned from his defeat, adapted, and he had all the time in the world to prepare. In the fall of 1987, nearly 2 years after the gates opened, strange things began happening with increased frequency. The dead zones expanded rapidly. Creatures from the upside down appeared in greater numbers. The sky over Hawkins took on a permanent red tinge, and Will's senses screamed that something massive was coming. This was it, the final confrontation. Everything they'd fought for, everyone they'd lost, had led to this moment. The situation in Hawkins had deteriorated beyond containment. The gates were no longer just cracks. They were spreading aggressively, consuming the town block by block. The upside down was bleeding through, transforming Hawkins into a hybrid reality where both dimensions existed simultaneously. The government had given up trying to explain it away. They'd evacuated most residents and established a military perimeter around the town. But our group refused to leave. This was their home. This was where it all started. And this was where it would end, one way or another. Elle had been training intensively, pushing her powers further than ever before. She'd learned to not just fight Vecna, but to potentially sever his connection to the upside down entirely. But it would require her to confront him directly, in his realm, in a psychic battle that might kill her. Hopper, now fully recovered and officially Elle's father, struggled with the knowledge that his daughter would have to face this danger. But he also knew Elle was the only one who could stop Vecna. So instead of trying to protect her from the battle, he prepared to fight alongside her. Will's visions had evolved. He wasn't just sensing the upside down. He was seeing specific plans, specific movements. Vecna was assembling an army, preparing for a final assault. The Mind Flayer itself was taking more direct action, no longer content to work through proxies. And Max, after nearly 2 years in a coma, began to show signs of awareness. Not waking, not exactly, but her fingers would occasionally twitch, her eyelids would flutter. Elle, maintaining her vigil, noticed these small changes and realized something crucial. Max's consciousness wasn't gone. It was trapped somewhere, possibly in the Upside Down, possibly in Vecna's realm. If they could reach it, they might be able to bring her back completely. This became a dual mission: stop Vecna and the Mind Flayer permanently, and rescue Max's consciousness from wherever it was imprisoned. The group made their preparations. Weapons, both conventional and unusual, plans for entering the Upside Down, fallback positions. They all knew this time was different. No more close victories, no more last-minute escapes. This was everything. Nancy had become a hardened strategist, having spent 2 years investigating Vecna and the Upside Down's nature. Steve had evolved from the popular kid to a genuine protector, someone the younger kids genuinely looked up to. Robin had become the group's researcher, understanding the science as much as it could be understood behind the interdimensional crisis. Jonathan and Argyle brought unconventional thinking that sometimes proved valuable. Lucas had become fiercely protective, determined to save Max, even if it meant dying in the attempt. Dustin carried Eddie's memory as motivation, determined to finish what his friend had died for. Erica, now older and even more formidable, refused to be left behind. And Mike had become the heart of the group in a different way than before. He kept them connected, kept them focused on why they were fighting, not for glory or revenge, but for each other. For the chance to actually live lives free of monsters and trauma. As the first episode of Season 5 showed, the Upside Down's intrusion reached a tipping point. The sky over Hawkins turned permanently dark, shot through with red lightning. The temperature dropped. The vines spread through the streets, pulsing with malevolent life. And in the centre of it all, visible now to anyone who looked, was the Mind Flayer, its massive shadow form, towering over the town like a dark god, its tentacles reaching down to touch our world. Vecna made his presence known through broadcasts, through corrupted electronics, speaking directly to the people of Hawkins. He explained his philosophy again, his belief that humanity's civilization was a cage that needed to be torn down. He wasn't just trying to conquer the world, he wanted to liberate it, in his twisted view, by destroying the boundaries between reality and the Upside Down. The military tried to fight. They fired on the creatures, attempted to bomb the gates closed, threw everything they had at the incursion. It accomplished nothing. Conventional weapons couldn't stop this. Only El could. Only the group that had been fighting this battle for years truly understood what they were facing. In the episodes that have aired, we've seen the group's determination solidify. They know what's coming. They know the cost might be everything. But they also know that if they don't stop this now, if they let Vecna succeed, then everything they've fought for, everyone they've lost, will have been for nothing. The battle lines were drawn, the pieces were in position, and somewhere in the depths of the Upside Down, Vecna waited, confident in his inevitable victory. But he'd underestimated something fundamental about these kids from Hawkins, Indiana. They'd grown up fighting monsters. They'd lost friends, lost innocence, lost the carefree childhoods they should have had. But they'd gained something too, an unbreakable bond, forged in darkness and trauma, that made them stronger together than Vecna could ever be alone. The final battle was coming, and whatever happened, whatever the cost, they would face it together. Closing. 236 Orihar 240 for Oid. And that, for now, is where the story stands. We've travelled together from 1947 to 1987, from Henry Creel's first breath to the brink of the final battle. We've watched children become heroes, watched a small town become the centre of an interdimensional crisis, watched ordinary people face extraordinary darkness. The ending is still being written. The final episodes of Season 5 will show us how this decade-long struggle concludes, whether Elle and her friends can close the gates forever, whether Max can be saved, whether Vecna's philosophy of destruction can be defeated by the simple power of people caring for each other. But regardless of how it ends, the story of Stranger Things has always been about this: friendship in the face of impossible odds, courage when everything seems lost, and the idea that love, whether romantic, familial, or the deep platonic bond of chosen family, is stronger than any monster, any government conspiracy, any force that tries to tear us apart. These kids from Hawkins, Indiana, who just wanted to play D&D and ride their bikes and have normal lives, became the thing standing between our world and darkness. Not because they were special or chosen, but because when evil came to their town, they chose to fight it together. And that's a story worth remembering as you drift off to sleep tonight. Rest well. The battle in Hawkins can wait until morning. Sweet dreams.